Hi, my name is Crystal Taggart, and I am the author of the upcoming book, Build My App. My book teaches entrepreneurs how to launch their startup for less using low-cost and open-source tools. Today, I'm excited to talk to Ben Busse, who is the product manager at DreamFactory. DreamFactory is a solution that's actually highlighted in my book, and it basically allows you to create REST APIs with no coding whatsoever, saving a ton of time on your software development project. So Ben, to kick off the interview, I just want to say that I am a super fan of the DreamFactory platform. I saw it, and within 5 minutes of using it, I was completely in love. It meets a lot of my criteria for launching a startup. So the first question I want to ask is, can you give us an introduction of what DreamFactory does and why everyone else should love it as much as I do?
Yeah, great question. So I think the idea of the auto-generated APIs is really important, and when you look at it, what does that mean? So it means basically that when you connect to a database, DreamFactory provides an API for you that's very comprehensive and really, really sophisticated in terms of what it can do. Now, then the question becomes, well, what types of data are you connecting to? It turns out that the core feature of the product that's used the most is this auto-generated API capability. And then if you dig into it more, generally most applications are data-driven, and actually it turns out that most of the databases are SQL. You see NoSQL as well, and we support that. But the classic case is I need an API for a SQL database, and I want to build an application on that. It could be, generally it's data that already exists, especially for enterprises. So you want to build a lightweight REST and JSON application connecting to existing data. So that's the core thing. And then the other features around that, most companies like to go to the next level, so they don't want to write like their own user management system, role-based access control, session handling. So DreamFactory provides all of those capabilities like totally out of the box and totally turnkey. So that's probably the second biggest thing, like API first, role-based access control and security, basically user management second. And then the third thing is, most applications are not just like create, read, update, delete generally. I mean, if they're very simple, they do that, but usually you need some kind of logic, whether it's, field validation, or you have things like workflow rules, like you want to kick off an email if a certain event occurs, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the third layer of functionality is a scripting and customization that you can do. And that basically means that you're writing some programs with different languages, and we provide basically a scripting engine to do that and support various languages. JavaScript, Node.js, PHP, and Python are the current languages, all interpreted languages. We're going to add more languages in the future. But that's, kind of the next level is, yes, you're going to do a little bit of programming typically, but all of the key things like protecting your API, getting the API in the first place, DreamFactory does all that for you. So again, it's trying to like really collapse the time from, months and months down to weeks and preferably even days if you're just doing a prototype type of application.
Right, absolutely. So when you think about like the platform, what are some of the most underutilized features that people should know about?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So what we find is there's some, it's a sophisticated product, so people need to dig into it. We try to provide some good tutorials, some sample applications that people can use. So a lot of it is really just like discovering what's possible with the product. And I said, so they are like one of the kind of the key things that we try to explain to people is the API itself is like really sophisticated in what it can do. So it supports things like the obvious things that you need to do, create, read, update, delete on tables, but there are a lot of very sophisticated features in there, doing complex joins with things like foreign key relationships, supporting stored procedures and functions, and also programmatic API access to the schema of your database, which opens up a lot of capabilities. So they are like, it's really like, what do we try to explain? Like this API is very comprehensive and it covers all of the bases with databases. SQL, NoSQL, and file storage as well. So that's really important. The other thing is we've spent a lot of time, especially in the last year, like really looking at more complex scenarios and how to try to make those complex scenarios more simple without having to write code. So an example of that is a really key feature that, again, I wish it was maybe more discoverable for people, and we want to do more tutorials and things like this. But the idea of doing relationships between different databases without writing source code. So that we call this construct a virtual foreign key. So for example, if you have tables that aren't related with your schema, like say you have an email address and you want to connect two different databases or two different tables in the same database, but they're not related in the schema at all, you can basically impose a relationship using DreamFactory very simply. Like you just go into the user interface and you say, I want this field and I want this field to be connected. And then our API, the DreamFactory API, then just lets you call using a parameter called related, and then you can just call that virtual foreign key. So the use case here is I have disparate data in totally different databases and I want to connect them and I don't want to have to write code. That's what virtual foreign keys do. So that's a really powerful feature. And then other things that, I think those are probably the biggest things, like knowing what you can do with the API. And then beyond that, understanding the capabilities of server-side scripting. And this is really, really open-ended so with what you can do because it's programming. So you can do all sorts of orchestrations you can do on both the request and the response. And so that's something that is really important to know about. And then one last feature I'll mention is that, the philosophy of DreamFactory is like, don't write your own APIs. There are a lot of reasons why you shouldn't, including it's very time-consuming. You want reusability, so you can build lots of applications that reuse the same APIs as opposed to tightly coupling your APIs to each and every new application. So don't do that. But sometimes this last feature is occasionally you do want to, you do have a use case where you do need to write a custom API. So DreamFactory doesn't preclude you from doing that. In fact, it supports it really well. So with the scripting languages, you can actually write your own APIs from scratch if you need to. But we generally say, hey, that should be 5 or 10% of the cases typically, because again, it's auto-generating. If it's data, like structured data, documents as a NoSQL or file storage, completely done for you. If you already have an API, that's not a problem. You can hook it up with DreamFactory as well. It's just a remote HTTP call. And then lastly, if you need to resort to writing your custom API, generally you shouldn't have to do that, but if you do, you can. So that's kind of a lot to say, but those are the key things, really, like discovering the features and starting with the auto generation as the key thing to start with.
So within enterprises, I've actually worked to get your product implemented at an enterprise, and one of the biggest concerns when I talked to the DBAs and infrastructure folks was, oh my God, you want to do what to my database? Right? They're like, what? There's access to the database? Because they're freaking out on me, right, about the security, because it's really easy to expose your whole API if you don't set up the security correctly. So the question is, what's kind of the advice that you would give to entrepreneurs and developers to set that up correctly to begin with, so you're not accidentally letting people hack into your database and download all your data?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one thing, the philosophy in general, a good security philosophy is be very explicit in terms of what you're going to give people access to. So when you set up an API, say, take an example, you're setting up an API for, I don't know, Oracle or MySQL, some database. When you do that in DreamFactory, basically securely stores their credentials. So at the start, it kind of, one important thing is it inherits the security of those credentials. So whatever username and password you put in, from a DBA perspective, it's going to use those security permissions. Now, DreamFactory has a whole role-based access control layer on top of that. And the philosophy there is start very restrictive, right? So basically, with role-based access control, you don't give access to anybody until an administrator in DreamFactory opens up access. And that access meaning table-level access, record-level access to the rows, and even column-level access, which you can easily implement as well. So you have to be very explicit about how you grant those permissions in DreamFactory. The other thing to point out is DreamFactory, the administrative console, is a great user interface. It works really well when you're working in a kind of lower volume scenarios where you're building a few applications and the permissions are relatively simple. It also, the whole system is actually a set of REST APIs. So there's a system REST API that governs everything, like creating roles, creating all of the access permissions. It's actually can be done programmatically. So that's another important thing. But generally, you start by not exposing anything and then being very selective about what you expose. And in a large database, you're typically not needing to expose very much. I mean, you look at it from the application perspective. Maybe you need to expose a dozen tables, maybe a lot more, but generally if you have thousands of tables, you're not going to be exposing very many of them, maybe a few % of all of those tables. So that's where you start with exposing nothing and being very careful, as opposed to the reverse, which would be, oh, expose everything and then limit it down. So you don't want to do that. The other thing I would say about testing APIs is it's important to really like automate it if you can. So there's, you look at API endpoints, it's pretty easy to write automation. Even from the command line, you can hit a lot of endpoints. And just because, if you think about it, if you have a session token, you have access to the API that your role governs. So you can, what you want to do is you want to actually write up test scripts. You can do the testing manually, but you really want to automate it as much as you can to kind of loop through all of the roles and then try to hit every endpoint in the database and confirm that you're getting 200s back, basically green light for the ones where you've granted permissions and then forbidden or, basically not able to access those other endpoints. So automate if you can. If you're a smaller company, you probably can't afford to do that sometimes. You don't have the skill set. There are actually lots of good QA services out there that you can sort of QA as a service, and they can do a lot with APIs. DreamFactory APIs are just endpoints. There's nothing special about them in terms of the API endpoints themselves. So you can set up all those endpoints, and then you can hit them with automated QA, whether you're building out your own self or you're using a testing service that's out there.
Yeah, but even to that point, though, based off of what you said, it's easy enough to create a curl script that goes through, creates a user, and tests each of the services. I mean, it is one line of code that shows, that calls it and shows a result, right? So I think that is a fantastic suggestion. So I have another question about versioning. So, I've worked in a lot of organizations where a lot of time is spent on managing versions of code. So because it's dynamic, because DreamFactory is dynamically driven from the schema, how do you guys recommend kind of handling versioning of the APIs, particularly with apps where you can't actually control when users upgrade all of the time? So what would you do? What advice would you give on that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and here it's interesting. For some reason, there's not for some reason. The history of this with versioning APIs is that typically, historically, and even today, a lot of people still write their own APIs, and that's the way you do things. So yes, you do need version control if you're hand rolling your own APIs. What we say, and this works really well, is that if you build an application and the application grows in terms of functionality. For example, you add some new capabilities, you adjust the schema, you even add new tables maybe as the functionality expands. With DreamFactory, the way it works is once you've set up that connection to the database, it just automatically, it caches everything, but then you can refresh the cache and it will just get whatever the schema is. So actually the need to version control, like V1, V2, V3 on the APIs, actually goes away to a large extent. As long as you're still using that same connection string to the database. So that means that you don't really have to version control the API. Now, if you're actually changing the database, and one thing that DreamFactory is really nice is the API endpoints are actually very abstracted. In other words, they're the same endpoint paths and features, whether you're connecting to an Oracle database or to Postgres or MySQL or DB2 or SAP, whatever the database is, the endpoints actually work the same way. So if you, for example, wanted to change database vendors, or you're like, all right, we're going to change to actually a different database, that's actually a different consideration, right? So there you would have a new API that you would create in DreamFactory, and you could still have the old API out there, but it's going to be a different API name. So that's analogous to versioning. The key thing, if you ever have to version in that scenario, like you change data stores, like you want to use Mongo now and not, MySQL. Let's say you did that. You actually don't have to change the application code really, very small, like a couple of syntax things, but very little. But you don't want to break the existing apps. So never remove the old API until you're really, perhaps decommissioning it. That goes the same for if you have to do version control just outside of DreamFactory. This is obvious, but people actually forget it. Oh, like we can kill that API and then all this stuff breaks. But we think actually versioning tends to be over-engineered. I mean, what you really want to do is just have the API work and not have to worry about pushing schema from dev to test to production. It shouldn't, you shouldn't have to version. I mean, imagine every time you change a schema, you have to do another version. I mean, that can be dozens of versions of your API, which is just like really complicated and tends to be, kind of unnecessary, we think.
Great. So one of the tools that I love is Apri.io. That's actually how I found you guys, was on one of the Apri.io community forums. They were talking about using your services. And so, that solution, basically with just a little bit of JavaScript knowledge, anyone can build a real mobile app. So do you guys have kind of a web UI code generation partner that is as easy to use as Apri.io? They generate, they do have some UI code for websites, but it's not quite where I want it to be. I want to have server-side control of it, and their stuff is all HTML.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the short answer on that is we are very, very focused on being the best in the world, really, at middleware, open source middleware. Like covering that layer is really what we focus on the most. So we don't have we're not building our own client-side technologies to do that. Like it's very, there are a lot of good solutions out there. It's actually a very competitive space, and it changes very quickly. So you look at the HTML5 and JavaScript toolkits, everything from Angular 2 to Ionic, all of the native toolkits are out there. But what we want to do is provide enough starter code, and so we are planning on doing more of that, and that continues to be a focus on the roadmap. So a couple of examples of that. We like Swagger a lot. In the API docs of DreamFactory, you can hit a database and it will show you the request URI and the response that you get back with.
I love it. I love that feature. It helped me figure out how to use your platform, actually.
Yeah.
So it was easy to use.
So we're really a big fan of Swagger, just as an API documentation tool. And so we use it in the product as basically an iframe that runs inside of the DreamFactory user interface. If you go and download DreamFactory, you'll see how it works. So actually in this sprint, we're expanding, in addition to just curl, we want to show kind of all of the popular, so AJAX call, like how do you do that with a specific API call. But the thing is, there's nothing sort of magical about DreamFactory, like there's nothing proprietary about it. It's just HTTP endpoints that you're calling. So, and we have users that are everyone from like have never written any code all the way to like superpower users that have been developers for decades and they understand it all. And we actually want to kind of cross the spectrum from like novice all the way to expert. So we're not going to we're not going to build like client-side toolkits that are like very DreamFactory specific. We're going to support all of the really popular ones. And we do that with more code examples in Swagger. So we'll show all of kind of the popular ways to generically call HTTP endpoints, like right in the API, but in the context of that particular API call that you're making in Swagger. So then you can kind of copy and paste that and put it into your application and start actually building something. So that will be useful. The other thing is we have these sample applications, and we will definitely revisit this. So in the product, you can install basically an application from GitHub, and we have a bunch of, it's basically an address book application, so it's a little bit more than Hello World, but it's not super, super advanced. And that actually shows source code and has a good README file that shows actual making API calls, whether it's Angular, Angular 2, React, JavaScript, Swift, Android, a couple others are in there, Titanium and .NET, and we'll be adding more, like we're going to add Ionic in the next sprint. So we want to provide more examples there. The other thing is we're filling out the documentation quite a bit more. So if you actually go to our website, resources, there are a bunch of docs there, and we are going to show more code examples in there. But long answer, but the short of it is basically we don't have partnerships with the client-side companies, but we do want to make it easy for anybody to figure out like how do I write client-side code that's going to connect to these APIs really easily.
Okay. All right, great. So are there plans to integrate to other open source platforms like WordPress or things like that? Do you have a WordPress plugin, please?
We don't have a plugin, so let's talk about that a bit. So we have been from a roadmap perspective and the evolution of the product, we've been very, very focused on the auto-generation capabilities. Now we're at it, the product is maturing and really, really getting strong because it's been hit by hundreds of thousands of developers now, and it's being used in big enterprises now. So now we're actually turning more of our attention towards some different features in the product with examples and with some partnerships that will be evolving over the coming year and beyond that, really. One of the key ideas is being able to use, we call them like third-party APIs that could be open source or they could be commercial. So examples of that would be, think of a WordPress or payment APIs like Stripe, Dwala, etc., or maybe it's SNS like Twilio, and there are hundreds of these literally, and there are companies that Zapier and others that do a lot of good work with these types of APIs. So we want to make it a lot easier to get those APIs in DreamFactory. It's actually very easy, but you do have to follow some directions, and what we want to do is like reduce the friction to get those things inside of DreamFactory. So what does that mean? It means that we will be doing some partnerships, but mainly more in the realm of going out and doing meetups and things where we show how these things are used with companies such as Twilio and others. Now, WordPress is a great example. Like a good API for WordPress to build on top of WordPress is awesome. We have a case study of that, but we want to just have it more like you go into DreamFactory and then you want to hook up WordPress and you click it and then it just brings in the Swagger definition of WordPress, and it's like what's your base URL basically for that, or any API key or any headers that are required, like kind of, and have it very like all config, like just type it in and save it and it like lights up, just like the databases light up today.
Yeah,
like,
well, I was able to hook up my Mailgun database or my Mailgun email service. It took me maybe 15 minutes to set that up, which is insane, and it had all of the documentation there for me. All I had to do, I actually set it up wrong. I put in the wrong URL, but once I figured it out, I was like, oh, it's just working. So it was really easy to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting. I mean, it's one of these things where I think it's, again, like speaking of features that need to be used more, I mean, that idea is really key. So the idea is that you should be able to hook up any web service. It could be HTTP, or actually SOAP is another one. It's legacy scenarios where you have a SOAP WSDL and you need it to be REST and JSON. We support that as well. But the idea of just making that super easy, and that can be made even easier, and I think the way it can be made easier where it's just, select the thing that you want, and there should be a menu of lots of these basically remote web services, pick it, and then it just kind of lights up. Like you have to type in a few things, but that's it, and it should be very self-guided and very easy. So like you can do this in the product today, but we need to make it even easier, and that's definitely going to be a focus from a roadmap, and we're embarking on that effort now. We're going to start putting together Swagger definitions for all of these. We'll put these on a GitHub repo, and then pretty soon after that, we'll do some more integration where it's kind of like tied more into the product, where you can just get it. Like today, you can import apps, and you'll be able to import HTTP services from a lot of options here pretty soon.
So basically, for these third-party companies who have existing REST API for their services, I think what you're saying is that if you can create a Swagger definition for it, contact you, then they can add it to your platform, plug and play?
Yes, and in fact, if anyone's watching this and is interested in, we're an open source product, and the features and functions the vast majority of them are free and open source. So this is a case where we love contributors. So if anyone likes using Swagger and they like DreamFactory and they want to provide Swagger definitions to the community for all of the web services that they like to use and show people, that would that's great. Those are great contributions, and we would be very happy to have that. We're of course as a company going to develop our own as well, but we do really like contributions from the community at large.
All right, awesome. So one of the questions that I have is in terms of scale, right? Because whenever you work with some product where you're not handling the guts of it, yeah. What's kind of the largest number of transactions that you guys have seen before you have to add new servers and scale out?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So let me, stepping back a little bit on scalability. So DreamFactory is, what's really nice about it is that there's nothing magical under the hood. At its essence, it's a LAMP stack, a modern LAMP stack, meaning that it uses all of the things that the latest versions of different open source technologies. So there's a web server, you can use Apache or Nginx, you can actually load balance just like you would any other LAMP stack. We actually, by the way, support Windows as well, so you can install DreamFactory on a Windows server or servers, and you can actually use IIS even as a web server, so we support that as well. So that's really good because there's nothing that, from a skill set perspective, like DevOps team that knows LAMP stack kind of knows DreamFactory. I mean, there are some frameworks that we use based on PHP 7 and Laravel. We're moving to PHP 7 now. So that's really good. There's nothing unique about it in terms of scalability. So, and we have some good white papers on this that actually in our documentation where you can kind of see how it's set up. So if you want to learn more about scalability, and to answer that question, I mean, we've done some testing, and if you like Google search, look up like it's DreamFactory scalability, you'll see there are a couple blog posts that we've done that show benchmark data. And the question you have to answer, it's not so much about the number of users matters, but it's more the peak load that you expect, and the ability of that peak load that you really need to look at. And then what's your, it's like optimizing that, and then what's your desired return? Is it 200, 300 millisecond? Like, you know, DreamFactory can return results JSON very, very rapidly, but you have to have enough hardware. So typically in our benchmarking, transactions per second is an important metric, so you can get in the 400-ish thereabouts in our own benchmark testing. If you go and get an EC2 large or X large without doing any load balancing, you can get 400 or 500 API calls per second, and then it's actually infinitely scalable in the sense that you can vertically scale it by adding more CPU power. You can horizontally scale it by load balancing, and then you have to kind of understand the economics of that. But the good thing is there's nothing unique or special about DreamFactory versus like if you were scaling WordPress, which is also built on PHP technology, or if you're scaling Facebook, which is also based on highly optimized PHP code. So you really have to look at it there. The benchmarking data will help you, but at the end of the day, you kind of have to look at your peak load, and is it 1,000 API calls per second, which is pretty significant, or 10,000, which is massive, or large, or even bigger than that it can support. And then the other, like low-level code-wise, there aren't a lot of hops, right? So there's a connection string to the database. You have to have this anyway. You're not going to store credentials on a client. So from an architecture standpoint, you're doing this no matter what. There's a small amount of overhead obviously with the code generation at runtime to take the API endpoint, convert that into a SQL query if it's connecting to a database. But this is a very small overhead in percentage terms versus if you were just writing, raw SQL source code and calling it. It's a little tiny bit of overhead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So you guys recently switched from an open source model to kind of an enterprise platform as well. So you've got kind of your open source version, your silver version, and your gold. Are there other plans to add more services in your subscription-based services versus open source platform?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So stepping back a little bit, just so everyone understands the question and the different subscriptions. We've gone through an evolution. So where we started was really everything was free and open source, and we actually sold support packages, and we still, part of what you get with a subscription is support from our core engineering team. So that hasn't changed. What has changed about 3 or 4 months ago is in the product we made the business decision to make some of the APIs themselves, the API calls like to different databases, commercial, meaning that, and that's actually the only distinction between the open source product and the silver, which the silver thing is really the instance, the runtime of DreamFactory, you install it. And so with the silver package versus the open source, what do you get? You get connections to proprietary databases, so Oracle, DB2, SAP. There are a few there. There are about 8 different APIs. Things like LDAP and Active Directory, very enterprise-centric features, we've also decided to make those commercial. So if you're not using any of those, it's still free Apache license and will continue to be. From a roadmap perspective, though, we're investing in both proprietary connectors as well as open source ones. So what we want to do is add more and more automated connections. So things like, take for example, Redis, which we're doing in the next sprint, which will come out in about a month. And a really solid API for Redis, which is very, very nice. Cassandra, a good NoSQL database. These will be open source. So our core engineering team continues to invest in open source heavily because this is just important product features that we need, that customers and developers need. So continue to invest in that. We will invest in other proprietary databases as well, but really we've covered most of the bases there. And so that's kind of how it works from a a runtime perspective. The runtimes are like identical except for some of the API connections to proprietary databases. Now the gold package, what that is really, think of that in a nutshell, that's really for like real production deployments when you need dev, test, and production, and maybe you need multiple dev, test, production instances. And so when you look at the economics of that, the silver package with the proprietary databases, these are priced per instance. What's an instance? It's where you install DreamFactory. So it's like a URL, basically, is how you can think of it. So if you have a development, a test, and a production instance, those are 3 different instances that we would charge for, and you may have dozens of those in a larger deployment. So it starts to make more sense, not only economically, but from a management perspective, like technical management perspective, to license the gold product. The gold product is basically, it's the management console for the runtime, if you can think about that. So it has the ability to deploy DreamFactory instances, plural, across dev and test and production in a way that there's actually shared compute. So basically shared VM, multi-tenant. Like, so think about Salesforce.com, multi-tenant system, sharing CPU, sharing physical database server, right? So DreamFactory, the gold subscription supports that capability. So you can actually share compute. And what it also does is it provides API management capabilities. So basically being able to throttle API calls, like limit how many API calls are coming through the system without having to build all of that stuff yourself. It also, we have a partner, Elasticsearch, and that product is actually embedded in the gold subscription. And that's really for logging. So the Elk Stack, Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana provides kind of audit capabilities, really for not so much for developers, but for the operations teams that are managing the DreamFactory system in production. They want a lot of information. So the way I think about it is the open source product is a great solution if you're like, I'm just using open source databases, I don't need the management capabilities, maybe I just need one instance, or I just have a couple of instances. Free, forever, use it, it's great. The silver is really for, commercial deployments where you've got to hook up to a commercial database, but you really may only need the runtime. You don't have a very complex scenario. You're building the applications and you need maybe one production instance and you've got a few apps in there. And then the gold is really for larger deployments, and these tend to be larger companies that are subscribing to this package where you really have more management needs, compliance needs as well, and like governance. Actually need an answer about, okay, well, does everything get logged? Where does it get logged? How can we see it? And having to handwrite a lot of that is painful. So we try to solve that with the gold subscription for you.
So what I'm hearing you say is that as an entrepreneur, you can start with kind of the open source version, and you can actually plan to expand that and integrate it with other enterprise systems as your organization grows. So it's something where you can actually build on top of your platform as your company grows.
Absolutely, yeah. And what, the other thing I should mention is we're doing a lot of investment in the capabilities for like deployments or migration. So one important construct in the product, it's actually in the user interface, it's called packages, and it has its own API as well, a system API. So the packages idea is that you should be able to export all of the work that you do basically as a simple manifest, is basically a JSON file with all of the stuff that you've created. You're basically in DreamFactory. So the schema definitions, all of the roles, all of the users, all of the applications, the API keys, all of that. That can just be bundled as a package file. It's actually a physical file, and then you can push that file between different instances of DreamFactory. So why that's helpful is that you, like for example, you could start with the open source, see how it works, and then do some prototyping. Maybe you're just going to rely on MySQL or Postgres, open source databases, MongoDB, etc. And then you like it a lot, and you're like, well, the economics of this would be really good, but we have other databases. So you can actually take all of your work, and it's actually seamless to upgrade. It's easy. So even without the packages, you can just get keys from us, and it will just, those APIs will light up. They'll just work. You just need a key to unlock it. And then you can also do deployments with packages. So it makes it easy to move from dev to test to production with the package files. So like whether you're using the open source product or you're going and upgrading to commercial, the upgrade is simple. You just get keys. There's no migration needed at all. And then regardless of whether you're using open source or commercial, moving from dev to test to production is pretty easy with the packages capability. And then the enterprise product kind of takes that a step further because it lets IT teams kind of curate the APIs, meaning that they can use the package file construct to set up instances that have custom APIs. Like, here's a development team. I'm going to give that development team access to this particular set of APIs. And all of those APIs are just encoded in a file. And so in every new instance that gets spawned by a developer just uses those APIs that are in that file. And they would not get anything else.
That's actually a great point around deployments, because I know I work with a company now where you've got a team of 4 developers copying and pasting code between servers to get their stuff up and running. And I for a lot of companies, they have SOC audits where they want separation of duties, where certain people have access to certain permissions on the servers. So with that package implementation, you can actually give that back to your server administrations and create that separations of duties between developers and sysadmins who are maintaining servers.
That's right, and you can in fact go even further. I mean, we see companies that are obviously very hardcore about compliance, and so what they want to do is have these package files actually in source code repository, like under version control. So think of this as like it's kind of the metadata definition of a set of things in DreamFactory, right? A set of apps, a set of schema, whatever it is. And it can be the global set of things as well. So you can actually, not only can you use packages, you can actually export the whole thing as a file. So you can then save that file. So you can do backup and restore of your instances with the Gold product as well. So this is, if you think about compliance, it's like, you want some, like, what was the state of the world? You want to be able to version control a lot of that, and you want an easy way for like IT to kind of control what gets deployed, kind of what developers can actually use. That's kind of important.
So are there any other interesting partner integrations or things that you're working on? You talked about Redis, you talked about Cassandra. Do you have anything else that's exciting that's coming?
Yeah, so one thing I should mention, so we've really been focused on from types of apps that get built, definitely mobile. Mobile will continue to be super important indefinitely, especially with enterprise. You think of the consumer space, that's like pretty mature, like really mature actually. iPhone came out in 2007, and that's really quite kind of saturated. The enterprise world, however, is just trying to get around to, to different degrees, of course, but to how to build really solid mobile apps and actually how to do that at scale economically, and also just like operationally, how do you do that? You're building thousands. What's kind of interesting, and people will debate this, but the Internet of Things, we're interested in industrial IoT, not so much the wearable or consumer side from kind of our target market. So we are doing some interesting work with MQTT and basically building an open source IoT stack that's foundationally built on DreamFactory. This will be really good for things like if you have industrial IoT use cases and you're looking for a runtime stack to do everything from device registration to authentication to writing business rules, where you basically have a broker between MQTT standard and REST back and forth. So we want to bridge that, and so there are a bunch of interesting commercial IoT, Azure, Amazon, there are others, but we believe there's actually a very strong need for an open source runtime that's targeted at IoT use cases. So you can do some good IoT things with DreamFactory today. Our survey is actually about 10% of developers are using it for some kind of IoT use case. The rest is split pretty much evenly between mobile app dev and desktop app dev. About 90% is those, and it's about cut halfway in between mobile and web. So IoT is like 10%. Nobody really knows what's going to happen to IoT, right? If you read a different report, you'll get wildly varying views of what it is as a market and how fast it will grow. But there is a ton of innovation happening, especially big companies like GE are doing amazing things. And so we do think that strategically there's a really interesting opportunity there. So you'll be hearing more about that, and we will be doing things like with some of our partners, such as Verizon's a big partner of ours, doing very interesting IoT things. So you will be hearing more about that pretty soon. And we've got some really cool demos around the corner, actually, in the August timeframe that will be coming out with this MQTT integration. So that's probably one of the big things. And then roadmap-wise, we have a ton of other things happening, really related primarily around more integrations, just to make it easy, to hook up to your data, super fast, super easy. Some things with like scripting that will be interesting, like queued scripting, basically being able to do schedules, which is going to be really powerful. And then a lot on the some things with security, like more Active Directory type of support, like more sophisticated group support for AD, things like that. And then deployment is another big opportunity where we see like our real production customers doing really interesting things with Docker and Kubernetes and basically kind of container technologies. So with our Gold subscription product, we really want to support lots of different choices where you can have one management console. You can have development servers that are running Windows, and maybe you have Linux running somewhere else, and then you want to containerize for production, using Docker, and we want to support all of that really seamlessly, completely driven by APIs. So you can use an API to provision DreamFactory to Docker and then scale it up and down really easily from a console.
Yes, that's exciting stuff, so I can't wait to see some of it. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to walk through a hypothetical scenario. So I'm working with a company that just renewed their licensing for Zendesk, and the cost of that platform is $27,000 a year, right? So they've got 50-something users. Actually, they had 60-something users on it. Very used. It's a great platform. I like it for help desk support. So what I was actually thinking about was how you could actually kind of create your own Zendesk for a fraction of the cost. Basically for those not familiar with Zendesk, it's a help desk system that does a bunch of different things. So, first you can create your own custom fields on top of their core platform that are customized for your business. So you can ask specific questions and actually automate your help behind it. You can set up specific user roles with various rights on what they can see. So they've got kind of 3 primary roles in their base package: a user account who can see either their stuff or stuff that is theirs or stuff from their company. They have kind of an agent role that says, hey, you can see everyone's stuff, and then they've got the admin role who can configure the system. Users can create custom views based on their own search criteria, so things like ticket aging and priority. They actually have a really nice model for triggers, so it's like an automated process. When people save something, it will automate processes that do things. So basically, a use case example would be if someone escalates a ticket to high, you can actually send an email to the management team to go babysit that ticket and make sure it gets resolved. And then the other thing that they have is really cool functionality for automation. So after a period of time, it's going to run an automated process. So if if an agent responds to a ticket after 3 days, then it automatically, and the customer doesn't respond to it, it will automatically send another response, or it'll automatically close the ticket. So you can actually automate a lot of those things within Zendesk. So if I wanted to not spend $27,000 a year anymore, and I wanted to go build my own Zendesk, how would I do that from the back-end side of DreamFactory? What could it support where I don't have to, where I'm configuring it or setting up in my database versus paying for that functionality?
Yeah, so that's a great, that's a tangible example, and so that would exercise, a lot of DreamFactory's capabilities. And the nice thing about DreamFactory is that, the system itself, including actually all of the configuration, is itself a bunch of APIs. And actually a lot of the thinking behind this is really because, again, our history, we came out of the app development world as a company, especially on Salesforce.com. So we've kind of thought about what are the things that you want to be able to configure to build applications quickly that have lots of nice configuration for like end users, and these can be business end users. And the way to do that is to provide APIs that give you this flexibility, and you can actually build user interfaces that can do all of these things. So a lot of this is actually built in DreamFactory in the admin console. So if you look at some of the things you mentioned, and let me try to remember everything, but one thing is schema manipulation. So how do you, for example, have an end user who's able to add in the Salesforce parlance, it would be a custom field. So you have a table and you want to add a new field, and you just want to do that really quickly from a user interface. So in DreamFactory, in the admin console, an administrator can do that, like right from the user interface. You could just add a field and just save it. You could also, if you wanted, you could build a front-end application that would just make that API call. So you could build a micro app that makes that API call if you wanted to kind of, make it very very lightweight and not expose the other capabilities in the admin console. So that would be one thing. The record level access control is an important feature. So the role system, what that means is that in the Zendesk example, you would, and really with most applications, you're going to have multiple roles. And you might want to have rules on not only which tables of Zendesk can those roles access, but also which records. So in DreamFactory, you can build, we call it record level access control. And what that does is it lets you make arbitrary rules, like certain roles can only see certain types of tickets, that kind of thing, based on like just logic. So ands, ors, you just logic on those records. And DreamFactory at runtime will just like only peel back records or expose the ones according to those rules. So that is, again, just...
Where would you set that up at? Would that be a server-side scripting function? Because you can define table access within the role itself, right? And you can say what people can do. But where would you define the record level access?
So the record level access is actually also in that user interface. So when you go into the role setup, there's an option where you click, and then it lets you expand as many rows as you want, and each of those rows represents a logical condition. So you could have like, ticket age greater than 30, and whatever condition you want to have. You can have and conditions and just put those in without actually writing any server-side scripting.
Ah, cool.
Yeah, so that's really good. The other thing is if you have scripts, the role-based access control gives you access to the raw API endpoint, like, which tables can people access by the API. You can also, if you have scripts that are attached to API calls, like you have a script that does, maybe logging or something. Like whenever a database record gets inserted, you want to log that occurred, and you write a script to do that. You can expose the script and not the API endpoint to certain users, which can be useful in some cases as well. But that's more of an advanced scenario. The other thing that you typically want to think about is column level access can also be important. So if you have sensitive data, and there you would use a server-side script. We didn't want to really go overboard on the complexity in the user interface. We may make that kind of just another configurable option, like record level access control in the future. But you can basically, as you add schema, you can either update your server-side scripts to not expose that data by the API, like social security number or salary data or whatever it is in the database that you don't want to expose to a certain role. You can strip that data out pretty easily. It's pretty simple to set up. And you can also actually do that programmatically. So scripts themselves are API driven. So you could add a field to the schema and then programmatically update a script to remove that, like update the script programmatically. So
cool. Right. So if you build your logic the right way, then you can actually inject new scripts to filter out different information.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Exactly. Well, absolutely. So that's all very flexible. We'll think about access control. The role system, you don't have to write a role system. So it's DreamFactory has that all built in. So that would be really good. One of the features that's interesting that you mentioned was if you wanted to do things like you could build saved searches. So if you needed to do that, so you could have users actually in the user interface. There's a data manager. It's basically just a UI to see the data. So administrators filter data, sort data, search data straight from the UI. But if you were building a client-side, a different app that was very lightweight, even on a mobile device like a tablet, you might want to have a use case where people can have saved searches. That would also be pretty easy to implement from a code perspective. So you could, basically, the searches themselves are just URLs. They're just API calls, and they have a bunch of parameters at the end. What's the filter string that you want in the API call? So it would be pretty easy to build. Basically, you could build a table that's like a bunch of saved searches, and one of the data points in that table is the URL call that you need to make.
Right.
And then then when you hit that, it will hit the API with that. So that's actually a very simple implementation of a saved search, because the API is built on that whole construct. Like, it's all search. Search these records, get these records. So that's a fairly low effort type of thing that you would do. One of the other things, let me see if I'm remembering everything. So the next thing, the workflow. So say you want to have workflow rules where a certain event occurs, like this ticket is more than a day old, a week old, a month old, whatever it is. You can actually do synchronous, basically event-driven scripts right now. So when a certain event occurs, a condition occurs, you trigger an email or an SNS message based on the condition. And you would do that with an event script, a server-side script. The queuing concept, where you're basically running batch jobs at some scheduled interval, that we're supporting in the sprint that's coming out at the end of August, and we'll have some blog posts on that, kind of explaining it, because that's definitely was a popular request from the community. Was, okay, I love event scripting, but then how do I schedule these? So then what you could do is you could have, like, basically conditions. You're saving all this data, and then you would loop through it periodically and say, okay, what are all of the the cases where tickets are greater than 30 days, and then do something with that, like send an email and link to all of the IDs of those or whatever it is. And again, you would implement that with a server-side script, but it would have a scheduling component, so you can do these things more in an async type of way.
So you could actually create your own kind of homegrown Zapier type of functions within DreamFactory, so your own custom APIs. Like, that's exciting. So
definitely.
End of August, right?
Yeah, well, for the
scheduling, because I want this function.
Yes, the queued event scripts, if this, then that, but in a scheduled type of way. And kind of today, it's, again, just event-driven, so field validation, or insert a record, and then based on that record, like if it's a sales rep that's got a deal that's really hot now and greater than 100,000, email the manager or push notification to the manager. That's all supported today. This is the scheduling piece of it, where it will be in the next release. Which is
all right, that's exciting.
Yeah.
So I had somebody on Reddit who was challenging me, because I told them that any entrepreneur can build an app for less than $1,000, and they said, because somebody asked the question, if I had $25,000 to build an app, what would you do with it? And I said I would spend $1,000 on the app, and then I'd spend $24,000 figuring out how to get traction for the app, right?
Yeah.
So based off of what you said, what I heard was you can build out a whole back end of a Zendesk interface that you as an entrepreneur could sell, and you just have to pay for your UI development, which with your APIs is relatively easy to do.
Yes, I mean definitely relatively easy in the sense that you have the curiosity to get it done, and you're really driven. You have to be a little bit, I would say a little technical, but you don't need to be, learning how to, spending 2 years to program. I mean, it's gotten to the point now with not only our technology, but with a lot of other technologies that and there's so much on the internet that you can read about now, and so many examples that, if you're really driven, then yes, you could definitely do that. And the good thing is investing your time there, like, you'll learn so much that doing the next one, again, this concept of prototyping and just getting real data back is really important. So if you have an idea, if you're an entrepreneur, have an idea for an application, you want to kind of figure out whether you're solving a real need, and you don't want to spend a lot of money to do that. So this idea of prototyping for free as an all open source software, and not having to hire professional developers to get something up and running is super valuable, and it's really become, just in the last few years, a lot easier to do. I mean, even 5 years ago was a lot harder to do, and it continues to be easier.
I remember. So I spent $15,000 on software projects that didn't fly, and because I didn't want to code it myself, so I spent the money to go get it coded, and then only to find out, hey, it's really hard to sell this thing, or somebody else is doing it way better than what I could do it with my resources that I had as an entrepreneur. So now I can I can launch stuff for, you know, a few $100s because I can roll up my sleeves and use tools like DreamFactory, use tools like Appery to create my own apps and UIs, and basically just go, right?
Yep. Go, go, go. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Hopefully this has been helpful to people. I think it's a good kind of overview of the product. I encourage people to just try it out, regardless of skill level. It's very diverse in terms of what you can do with it, and we have just a couple things I'll mention. We have documentation. So we have if you go to wiki.dreamfactory.com, there's a bunch of docs there. Bunch of video tutorials. We're doing more and more of those. They seem to be pretty helpful to people, just kind of learning about, okay, how can DreamFactory help me? Give me some tangible examples. So definitely go check out that. We also have a community forum, community.dreamfactory.com, where you can ask questions. It's moderated. We try to get answers to people as soon as we can, and we're really encouraging the community to step up and help other people too, and we have some definite power users on there that can help you out. So there are definitely resources there to try it out, and again, all free, all open source. Will always be a free product, the core functionality. So go out and try it out, and definitely let us know what you think. We love feedback. Love to hear what people are doing and your stories out there. So get in touch.
Great. And just to promote myself a little bit, I am working on the book, Build My App. So I have a book that I'm working on. So if you want more information about that, you can go to buildmyapp.today. And I'm also launching a class where people can learn how to roll up their sleeves and code their own apps and learn how to launch their startups for less than $250. So
it's awesome.
Okay. Great.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. That was super informative and super interesting. Thank you again, Crystal, for your time, and Ben. And we look forward to collaborating again in the future.
Yeah.
All right. Great. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.